Before the Berlin Wall, the World War II victors decided it would be wise to divide Germany into the East and the West, which would then be divided into 4 parts. The first 3 parts would go to each of the Allies, the British, the French, and the Americans, and the 4th part went to Communist Russia. Dividing Germany, therefore limiting the access of Germany to its military to prevent another disruption by the Germans. The idea was that the Allies would own their parts of Germany and they would leave Germany ununified. But discontent filled the people of Berlin, and people started to leave East Berlin to go to the West. People went on strikes, started rebellions, and all in an effort for a free Germany. They wanted new economic policies and elections throughout Germany. Things started to get out of control in Berlin, so the Russians took matters into their own hands. The Russians brought in Soviet tanks and put an end to the rebellions and strikes. Hundreds lost their lives, and in that year alone, 332,000 more people left East Berlin. More and more people left, and the Soviets yearned for control of their people. In an effort to limit the people leaving East Berlin, as well as limiting the Allies to sections of Berlin, on June 27, 1948, Russia set up a blockade in East Berlin. The blockade cut off the flow of people so that no one could escape to West Berlin. This caused a lack of natural resources and food, which was essential to 2.5 million people in West Berlin. As an excuse for the people of East Berlin, the Russian government said that the blockade was protecting them from the Allies. Britain, the United States, and France then made a plan to fly in supplies to the people of West Berlin. It was called the Berlin Airlift. For 15 months, America, Britain, and France flew in food, natural resources, and everything else that was essential for survival that the people of West Berlin did not have. The Berlin Airlift made more than 200,000 flights assisting the people of West Berlin to keep them alive. More than 1,300 tons of supplies were flown in daily to the West Berliners. August 13th, 1961. That was the day that half of Berlin lost their freedom, families, friends, and jobs. Russia closed the border between East and West Berlin when they put up an Iron Curtain. The first thing that the Russians used to attempt to separate them was barbed wire. Later that year, they put up the first wall, and the next year, in 1962, they put up a second wall. It took about 5 years for the Berlin Wall to be completed.
So they could control the airwaves, they could block Western television signals and things like that. They could block newspapers, they could block the mail, they could block the telephone. The last thing they built to block was effectively the people moving from one side to the next.
Checkpoint Charlie was the only place in the wall where people were allowed to pass through. You were only allowed to pass through if you were from West Berlin. No East Berliners were allowed across by the Russians. Many people tried perilous ways of escape, but over 100 people died trying to escape, and many others were left behind, injured or dying. Many people tried to escape, but only about 5,000 actually made it. Some ways that people tried to escape were in the air via hot air balloons, zip lines and tight ropes, underground through tunnels, and right across the Death Strip. A considerably famous escape was executed at Checkpoint Charlie. A 19-year-old guard, Konrad Schumann, jumped over the wall while he was in uniform. It wasn't difficult for him to escape when he did, because at the point that he escaped, the wall had only been up for 3 days and it was only piles of barbed wire at that point. Konrad's escape became an iconic image of the Berlin Wall and an inspiration to others in East Berlin who wanted to escape. Cold War tensions led to a meeting with JFK and Khrushchev. Kennedy feared a Soviet takeover of Europe, so he increased military spending. Soon after, Kennedy made a speech in Berlin.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Economically, East and West Berlin were very different. East Berlin, the USSR, had no freedom to view the world as everyone else saw it because they were influenced by the communist propaganda, telling them exactly what to do with their time, jobs, family, and paychecks. The Russians would tell the East Berliners only what they wanted them to know, and were not always fair in their dealings. For example,
East German money, the official exchange rate was 1 to 6, but they gave me an exchange rate of 1 to 1.
The reason that the wall was built in the first place was because many of the most important workers in East Berlin were trying to leave to West Berlin because there were better jobs and better pay for them there. Political relations between Russia and America were very tense on account of the arms race. All of the tension between the two countries created some interesting spying programs like the Stasi. The Stasi were the communist secret police. Their job was to monitor all politically incorrect behavior amongst all citizens. They encouraged families to spy on each other and rewarded those who ratted out their family members, thus causing all-around distrust of the East Berliners for one another. The part of the Stasi that made it effective is that it employed around 90,000 people and that they thoroughly recorded all of their data. Another very large difference between East and West Berlin was socially. West Berlin was very indifferent to the situation. Families would carry on with their everyday lives and talk to each other and act in most situations as if the wall wasn't there. However, in East Berlin, the families were encouraged by the government to spy on each other, and they were always fearful that someone would ruin their family by exposing their blatant distaste for the communist government. Some might think that the guards of East Berlin were ruthless and had no urge at all to escape. That was the case for some, but for most others they wanted to get out as much as everyone else. To make it even more difficult for the guards to resist the urge to escape was that it was easier and more tempting for them to escape than the average East Berliner. All the guards of East Berlin needed to do was meander across the border to the west, and nobody would notice until it was too late. The reason that the Allied powers held on to West Berlin for so long was because of the domino theory. The domino theory proposes that if one country in an unstable area falls to communism, then the surrounding countries would fall to communism too. Glasnost, or openness, was Gorbachev's speech of December 1984, where he stated that people were now allowed to openly criticize the government without risk of punishment. Gorbachev also instituted perestroika, or capitalistic reforms, which stated that people could have semi-private businesses as opposed to before when the government owned all business. The reason that this was so important was because Gorbachev was the Soviet premier and he was relaxing on communism. This was the crack in the dam which caused the leak. 2 years later, Poland and Hungary had free elections. The Berlin Wall, the symbol of communism, was bound to fall. On June 12, 1987, the 750th anniversary of Berlin, President Ronald Reagan came to Berlin and challenged Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
2 years, 5 months, and 154 days later, the Berlin Wall fell. November 9th, 1989, Günter Schabowski received the note before the press conference that night that said that East Germans were allowed to cross the border with proper permissions. Yet nobody told him what to do with that information. At the end of the press conference, he read the note aloud, which in turn prompted a reporter to ask when the new regulations would come into effect. Since no one had told Schabowski differently, he replied, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay." After even more questions from journalists, he was asked if the regulations applied to the checkpoints in West Berlin. So, knowing no different, he replied that the regulation did apply to border crossings into West Berlin. The whole time, this press conference was on live television in East Berlin. This was the day that the infamous Berlin Wall fell. The news of the regulation spread like wildfire, and soon all of East Berlin was rushing to the Berlin Wall to visit the West again or for their first time. Finally, Berlin was reunited after 28 excruciatingly long years, and this was the beginning of a new era for Germany.
Since this was kind of a transition period, you still had Russian soldiers, you had East German Stasi, the security forces and things like that, walking around in uniforms, and you'd have tourists and a bunch of American soldiers who were on R&R, just kind of intermingling, very strange.
Families could be together again, friends could see each other again, and everyone was able to bask in the overwhelming sensation of freedom. Today, Germany is an economic superpower in the European Union, and is home to the first female chancellor in the EU, Angela Merkel.
You can shoot a soldier, you can't shoot an idea.